Hello, welcome to this week's 8.9 Newsweek Discussion. I'm Finlo Costain. Sainsbury's have announced that following a decade of development and 5 years of production, they're launching a new Taste the Difference Aberdeen Angus range with a 25% lower carbon footprint. Now, 10 years ago, carbon emissions were at the centre of environmental policy concerns. But have things changed? Does ecological security require a more holistic approach to livestock rearing that delivers climate change mitigation and adaptation and biodiversity regeneration? In other words, is low-carbon beef an out-of-date answer to the wrong question? I'm joined by Karl Williams, a director of FAI Farms, and by Clare Hill from New Foundation Farms and Planton Farm in Shropshire. Karl, it's been 10 years in the making. But why have Sainsbury's developed this low-carbon beef brand?
Great question, Finlo. I think, and first off, I would like to say that beef is an amazing product. I think, it's full of protein, vitamin B6, B12, iron, zinc, selenium, numerous other nutritional benefits to consuming beef. So, and I suppose from a product perspective, it is one of those products that's been under the media spotlight in terms of carbon footprint. It is one of those areas that's sort of pointed at beef, saying it's destroying the planet. I think consumers are generally told, if you want to reduce your carbon footprint, stop eating beef. Which I think, and to get some positive messaging, to sort of counter some of these arguments, I think is a fantastic job that's been done by Sainsbury's. I think, that 25% reduction, I think, again, shows the opportunities that are available within that supply chain, what we can do within beef production. We're not particularly integrated in beef production, so it's difficult to tell sort of an aligned story. So I think the fact that they've come out with this messaging is great. I think it's really good for the beef sector to sort of say that we can address this issue. We can reduce our carbon emissions.
So beef is an important product. Reducing our carbon is an important thing to do, and so that's a great starting point. So let's start with what's particularly good about this announcement. What's good about what they've done?
I think in terms of, I suppose, a reduction. I think, as an industry, we found it difficult to sort of, respond to some of the challenges in terms of, carbon footprints, environmental damage. So this announcement from Sainsbury's, working with that integrated supply chain and supporting those farmers financially within that supply chain, I think is a great message. I think, whether it resonates with the consumer is yet to be seen, but I think hopefully this is the sort of messaging that gets through into DEFRA government to demonstrate that we are doing something, within the beef sector that addresses our carbon footprint.
Tell me what you mean by an integrated supply chain, Karl.
So an integrated supply chain, so it's sort of connecting all of the steps within that. We've got, obviously, these animals are coming from the dairy sector. So again, it's taking them through a calf production phase. It's putting them then onto sort of different farms. So it's connecting all of those different elements within that supply chain to ensure that health is being managed correctly, nutrition. There's massive benefits that we can get from from linking all of those different parts up, as opposed to it being unintegrated. That cattle are moving. People are doing different things with them. We know the average finishing age in the UK is probably 24 to 25 months. So we know, we've got animals that are probably sitting 6-7 months either side of that. So we know we've got some of the more intensive systems that will probably be finishing at 18 months versus systems that will be finishing over 30 months of age. And those animals that are over 30 months of age will be coming into that supply chain with a large carbon footprint. So the more that we can work together, the more that we can work to align best practice and management within that supply chain, I think it will definitely benefit what we're doing.
Now, Claire, you've seen the announcement. What do you think about it? What's good about the announcement from Sainsbury's?
So I guess it's a clear statement on a lower carbon beef offering, which is great because that's one of the first, large scale supply chains we're seeing bringing that to market. That's what's good.
So fair enough. And Claire, Karl talked about the way in which beef is seen as being enormously high carbon. I wonder if you could talk us through that. Do you think that's accurate, and do you think that's fair?
So I think it depends on what metric, how you measure it, and so I guess what they are doing is looking at carbon specifically. And so if we just look at carbon with tunnel vision on just that, because it is key, then there are also different ways of measuring that. And we know that one of the reasons that beef has a high carbon footprint is because of its methane emissions from the rumen functioning to digest its food. And there are different measures, GWP 100, GWP star. So it depends on which measure is used as to actually how bad beef production is. There's also a really good saying, which is it's the how, not the cow. So there are some types of beef production which are inherently higher carbon when they are high cereal diet. Rumens are designed to digest grass, so in a high forage-based system, although taking slightly longer to finish potentially. It is a kind of overall better impactful system. So I'm struggling with myself here because I'm trying to stay focused on carbon. I tend to see it as in the whole. So I want to think about a lower input system being better for environmental benefits as well.
Well, let's stay with the carbon just for a moment and just have a think about that difference between those two carbon metrics, the GWP 100 and GWP star. Now, with GWP 100, one of the challenges is that it treats all greenhouse gases as though they behave in the same way. And of course, carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide have, very, very long lives, half-lives. They can stay, warming the atmosphere, just stacking additional warming, for up to 1,000 years, where methane has a short half-life. It's 10 years. And so after 20 years, if you've got a herd of 100 cows, or much bigger herd if you've got a national herd with a million cows in it, providing that herd hasn't increased, then although after 20 years the emissions continue, there isn't any additional warming, is there? And so when you're using the metric GWP star, then immediately through that assessment, the warming impact tends to fall by about 70%. And so rather than seeing beef as this high carbon polluting thing that needs to be eradicated, which is certainly what we've been hearing from many of the NGOs, it becomes a product with a much lower footprint in certain systems, as you say, the non-cereal systems, the more regenerative systems, and at the same time it's able to deliver those ecosystem services that I think we're going to come on to. Now, Karl, Sainsbury's say that their Taste the Difference Aberdeen Angus range has a carbon footprint that's 25% lower than the industry average. Can we talk about what that means and how they've achieved that?
Yes, I think, they've been very clever in how they've done this. They're obviously taking animals from the dairy sector. So I think they're putting specific bulls, on designated dairy farms, which will be, it seems to be an Angus, bull. So I think there'll be 3 or 4 bulls that they've identified that hit some of their metrics in terms of finishing times, grade, weight gain. Those calves are then coming through that supply chain. So again, animals that are coming from that dairy supply chain, certainly beef animals, are coming with a smaller carbon footprint. When you look at the emissions that come from mum, the dam, a lot of her emissions will be allocated to the milk, so the milk that she produces, whereas there is a small amount of emissions that are associated to the calf. So pulling that dairy cross beef calf, they're coming with a smaller carbon footprint. And obviously this whole process is about making sure that from a consistency and management perspective, you're treating those animals consistently, taking them through that supply chain, aiming for what I'm assuming is probably like a 0.8 to a kilo of daily live weight gain a day, which means they're going to be finishing from 20 to 24 months of age. And I think what's really interesting, even increasing daily live weight gain by 200 grams, so 200 grams a day, Yeah, that gives you an additional 75 kilos of live weight a year. So over a 2-year period, that's 150 kilos. That can reduce your finishing time from 2 to 3 months, which is a significant indicator. Because again, the longer those animals are alive, the more, and going back to your point, Finlo, the more they're emitting methane, which is their Achilles heel. So the longer those animals are emitting methane, the larger their carbon footprint is. So this is a really smart sort of approach that they've taken, looking at that specific supply chain, putting specific genetics in place, trying to reduce that age to slaughter.
I'm interested in what you were saying there about, some of their emissions being allocated to the dairy sector. So if you're just looking at beef as a calf that's been reared from a beef system into a beef supply chain, then all of those emissions are obviously associated with the beef product that comes at the end. Where if you're taking a calf that's coming from a dairy system and you're allocating some of the emissions to that dairy system, there are probably other opportunities as well, aren't there? And of course, one of the things that we need to do is to reintegrate, fiber back into the meat supply chain as well. We produce 60% of the clothes that we produce around the world. 60% of the fibers that go into the clothing around the world are from petrochemicals, and that's got to be replaced in the same way that we need sustainable food. And so by allocating some of those emissions to the fashion supply chain as well as the dairy supply chain, we can start to see emissions in the beef supply chain coming down. And I guess the question is that something that people would regard as creative accounting, or is it something which is just telling a more honest story about where that animal's come from and what it's being used for, Karl?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Finlo. And I suppose, the beef processors have got a role to play in this. They buy the whole animal. Obviously, Sainsbury's are buying a proportion of that animal. So how that allocation works is really important, because obviously, they're not just producing beef. As you say, they're producing a hide, which is going into the leather industry, and then clothing, car industry as well. That could be potentially going into, you've got liver offals, heart, lungs, which are probably going into pet food. There's a lot of other byproducts in terms of hooves, which again probably be producing things like gelatin. So that opportunity to allocate those emissions out correctly, so that beef animal is not just producing food. There's a lot of other products that come out of that supply chain. So how we allocate those emissions, and whether that's on an economic basis or whether that's on a biological basis, that debate is still ongoing.
Part of the emissions reduction, as Karl was saying before, is coming because they're being reared faster and they're being killed earlier. Is there an animal welfare concern with animals being killed earlier, having a shorter life?
Not in this type of system. I think directly, I don't think it's not like it's sort of the trick here is knocking a couple of months or off the end of the life, and that does bring benefits. I guess where potentially it could be impacting on the kind of animal welfare perspective of a life worth living is if there's extended housed periods, high grain proportion diets, which are, although not regarded as a classic animal welfare breach, they are cattle are grazers and browsers. Significant proportion of the diet would naturally come from trees, and a huge diversity of different plants and grasses and shrubs, and around and about. And of course, in a system where there's high amount of housing and feed, then that doesn't get met.
So a long life isn't necessarily a good life, and just because that life is a bit shorter doesn't mean that it's not a good life and that the animal welfare isn't being looked after through that time. You talked about feed there and the different sorts of feed. Karl, do we know anything about the feed that's being used, where that feed is coming from in terms of the Sainsbury's supply chain here?
No, and again, it's a good question, Finlo, and it's a great capability that Ruminant has, that it can take a lot of and when I say waste streams, Yeah, these will be products that are coming out of the food industry. So it'll be things like citrus pulp, brewers' grains, which are a byproduct out of the brewery industry, rapeseed meal, which is a byproduct from creating cooking oil. So and again, we can feed these to ruminants that can convert that into beef. So they're good converters of poor quality proteins and forages that we can't necessarily consume ourselves. So in terms of that, and again, those products will be coming with reduced carbon footprint because I suppose they're deemed as waste streams. As Claire said, grazing, it's probably our lowest carbon, lowest impact product that we can feed ruminants, and it's really, I suppose, what they've developed over millennia to feed on anyway. So again, it's just being careful about some of those waste streams, and some of those food sources where they're coming from. I would assume things like soy aren't a particularly big part of the beef sector. I think we've got the opportunity to tap into several different protein sources from a UK perspective. So again, soy is one of those feed products that will come with quite a big carbon footprint associated to it. Because if it's coming from Brazil, there'll be an allocation for land use change and deforestation associated to some of that.
Now, the Sainsbury's press release told us relatively little. It just told us that their carbon footprint was 25% lower, really. And even after going back and forth with the press office, it's been reasonably difficult to get additional information. And of course, that information isn't available to the general public unless, again, other journalists have, worked hard to bring that to the public's attention. The main story is that the beef has a carbon footprint that's 25% lower. Do you think that there's a danger because the story is incomplete, because the public are only being told one part of the story, that this could be seen as greenwash, particularly by some elements of the media and NGOs, and that this could come back to bite Sainsbury's?
Potentially, yes. I guess it's Johan Rockstrom's work on planetary boundaries is the recent. Well, it was years ago, at least 5 years ago, said that this is the decisive decade for humanity's future on Earth, and we have to start making real change. And that work has been redone, and all the planetary boundaries have gone further, and we have really, really exceeded some of those. And so I guess we need to move from this world of about doing less harm, of which we're 25% better than the average because we've got a 25% lower carbon footprint, should be congratulated because it's better than the average. But is it enough in the face of the real challenge that we're looking at? And I also would just consider the volume side of it, as in when you look, it's listed, it's in certain stores, but Taste the Difference is of course only a small proportion of the range of beef that offers. And so if I was to really challenge, then I would say, I think we probably need more, and also to consider the wider picture. Biodiversity loss, the watershed, water quality, all of these things that actually Karl's talked about. It's not just the beef, the actual bit that we think about we're eating. There's a whole cyclical process here, and the impact of the way those animals are kept on much wider things, of which we're one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. So what are we doing with our beef production to try and reverse that, because that is leading to higher volatility of temperature and storms and flood drought cycles. We're losing our biodiversity, which is having unknown consequences. And I just think, so for me, it's great, but I don't probably think it goes far enough, if I was to be truly honest.
Oh, what do you think? Is there a danger, a risk that this could be seen as greenwash?
I think in terms of, I suppose, what the public are seeing and sort of facing at the moment. We know, there's a lot of talk around net zero at the moment. Certainly around, what our Prime Minister has, I suppose, just announced over the last sort of 24, 48 hours. So I think that is sort of central to the debate, which obviously, it's difficult not to sort of have a marketing and comm strategy that sort of does address some of those issues that the consumer feels are at best, detached from. So if you can feel a little bit better about some of the beef that you're eating because it has a reduced carbon footprint, maybe that's not a bad thing. But I think, as Claire says, the opportunity to extend this further from just being about carbon to biodiversity to all of the other things that we know that beef production can support on farm through a regenerative system. I think that holistic approach then starts making much more sense, because then it dovetails into this public money for public goods sort of aspect that the government are pushing, that we're supporting biodiversity as well as reducing our carbon footprint. So these are the opportunities that sit ahead of us. But I would say it's a great start for Sainsbury's. It'll be interesting to see where they take it forward.
Indeed. Now, and I start. Sorry, Claire, you were going to come in.
I was just going to say, because that's the interesting thing, I guess, for me, is we know that net zero, if we are to just focus on carbon, net zero is so important, and we need to reach it really quickly. And people had made commitments around 2030, and they're sort of eking out into 2050. But so this is a 25% reduction. But where what's the route now to carbon neutral beef? And there are people who, doing carbon footprints on their farm, are achieving carbon neutrality on beef. So a 25% reduction would still indicate that there is quite a long way to go to meet net zero targets that everybody in the industry seems to be making.
Now, when I started the program with the introduction, I kind of implied that, just reducing CO2 emissions was a little bit retro. And of course, this has been a decade in development. And back 10 years ago, we tended to think in terms of environmental issues, certainly in terms of beef and a lot of farming. It was very much around the carbon dioxide emissions. Now, our knowledge has changed. Our understanding of ecological security has changed. And I understand that because this has been 10 years in development, clearly, Sainsbury's want to get some return out of that investment and that research. But in terms of ecological security, Claire, should CO2 emissions be the key outcome that beef producers and retailers pursue hard, or do we need to tell a different story?
I would say we need to tell a different story. 10 years ago when they started this, it would have been groundbreaking, and of course, and change is hard, and we know that. And the life cycle of beef is long, so it's actually not that many cycles of different breeding and different technologies in order to get us to this point. So it's a challenging one. The world is moving really fast on this stuff, but I think we.
So I was going to say, so in basic terms, what is the story that we need to hear instead? Instead of low carbon and just low carbon, what's the hook? What's the headline that we need people to hear?
I think it needs to be, I guess when we talk about regenerative, it needs to be regenerating. It needs to be regenerating soil health. It needs to be regenerating farmer livelihoods. It needs to be regenerating watersheds. And not just here in the bit that we deal with, but thinking about the ghost acres as well. So we think about the acres of where maybe we're bringing in feed, and where's that coming from, and what's the impact of that. So in my mind, to deal with all of the challenges. So carbon being one of them, but also some of the others that we mentioned, and then actually a system that regenerates on all of those levels is what we need.
Karl, is that something you'd agree with?
Yeah, and I think Claire makes some great points, because issues around water quality, biodiversity loss, these aren't things that are going away. So we are going to have to address them as an industry. And as Claire said, there's some amazing systems, there's some amazing work that is going on out there. But how do we scale that? How do we scale that? That we can pull that beef through that supply chain and tell that story to the consumer. And I think that's our biggest challenge is how do we communicate some of this to the consumer? Because some of it is incredibly challenging, getting that messaging across. You look at, packs, covered in labeling, people are in there time poor, they're grabbing whatever they can, predominantly, based on price as well. So there's a lot of different sort of factors in there, but I think we have an opportunity to really tell an amazing story around what we could do with beef. And as Claire said, that's about regenerating our soils, our biodiversity. Those opportunities provide us with a massive opportunity to re-engage with the consumer.
Karl, you talked about scaling, and I'm going to ask you in a moment how we get there, how we achieve that scaling. But Claire, I just want to come back to you for a moment, because, in the past, you were working at FAI implementing a regenerative beef system, which was adapted from the organic system that had been running before. And you were delivering really quite significant outcomes from that. Just tell us a little about where you got to with that system, what you were delivering.
Well, I think the first, lots of things, ecologically, but financially as well, and people. That we enjoyed running the farm, people enjoyed working on the farm, people wanted to come. But I guess, some of the main significant changes we made, for example, was outwintering on a farm that we were told, and we never thought we'd be able to outwinter on it. And anybody that we asked about it told us we definitely wouldn't be able to. But we did. And interestingly, on the fields that we outwinter, in a specific way, using adaptive multi-paddock grazing, so moving animals every day, not the old style of outwintering we imagine when we have a ring feeder in the middle of a quagmire of mud, but bale grazing, rolling the bales out and moving the animals every day so the land doesn't get damaged. With the ecological measurements that we've seen the best recovery and the best advancement of biodiversity in fields where we've been outwintering. And of course, the cost savings that come with that as well. And then there's the embedded carbon, so don't need so many tractors, not so much diesel, not so much straw, not so much managing of muck, because it's just going straight back in the ground. So that's a whole step that no longer needs to happen. And so I think it's seeing, and then it continues to go from strength to strength, that system. So I think there's some real opportunities. The problem, one of the problems, not the problem, these things are always multifaceted, is it takes a little bit of change in the way we think about what we're doing and how we're doing it and what we've always done and how we've worked and what the definition of good is, because the definition of good that maybe we're hanging on to isn't the definition of good for 2030, 2050 and the world that we want to leave behind for our children. We've got to adjust the way that I think we think about things, and so it might be a slightly different system. I get a little I understand the genetic selection and finding that down, but as soon as we're using, say, 5 bulls to put genetics across all of our system, we've totally lost our diversity. And that is, when we've started to do that in places in nature, that potentially sets us up for failure in the future. So a more holistic thought process to some of this, but that's hard to get our heads around.
Oh, let's go back to scale. Claire talked there about, the huge success that you've been having at FAI. And, for farmers looking in there, surely part of the element of scaling this is just to say, look, we're in so much of a better position now. We're more financially resilient. Our health outcomes are better. Our ecological outcomes are better. And we're making more profit. Surely that ought to scale itself.
Yeah, and I think it's a good question. And I think, you saying, farmers looking in, and I think that in itself is a pressure that we deal with within agriculture. I think farming is one of the few industries that is such an expression of your skill and management, because everybody can look over the hedge and see what you're doing. If you're within a sea of farms that are all set stocking, all over grazing, that's fine, because everyone else is getting the same outcomes as you, which is probably not great. So as soon as you start doing something different, whether that's rotational grazing or regenerative grazing, of course, everyone looks over the hedge and they're waiting for you to make a mistake. So that peer pressure in itself is quite difficult. And we saw that on the farm. You start making those changes, people asking you questions about your system, why you're doing it. And I think now, it really is it's an interesting question, because I would say, 2 years ago, people coming to the farm to have a look at the system, it was that sort of 80-20, that 80% of farmers thought we were completely mad. What are you lot doing? None of this adds up, doesn't make sense. 20% were like, actually, this is quite interesting. Whereas what we're finding now, and I think this is off the back of COVID and obviously, the war in Ukraine, which, we saw fertilizer prices pretty much double, within a space of a couple of months. Feed prices go up. So input prices became crippling, became absolutely crippling. And I think that 80-20 now, 80% of farmers that are coming are like, we're really interested in your system. Whereas we've still got the 20% that think we're crazy, but I think it's changing. That dynamic is changing. I think the word regenerative, I think, we have to break some barriers down in terms of, what does that actually mean? What does that transition look like? This is not, a case of, tomorrow, you're going to change practices and you're going to be regenerative. This is a transition, and I think, there's if we want to scale this, then I think that is policy and government, need to sort themselves out. I think there's still a lot of confusion, that is coming out of government at the moment. People don't really want to be making long-term decisions based off, what may well change in the next sort of, year or so. So, and again, supply chains, how they can support farmers to make that transition, connecting farmers, getting like-minded farmers together, as a group, because that in itself is really powerful, when you get like-minded people together. So again, as Claire said, this is multifaceted in terms of how we address this.
I think we're out of time, but thanks so much, both. I guess in conclusion, in summary, we're pleased to see that there is some progress in terms of low carbon beef, that we want to applaud what Sainsbury's have done, but at the same time, it's recognizing that there are more changes that need to come, that we need a broader vision of ecological security, and that we need to move from just low carbon to something which is delivering a greater range of outcomes, more holistic, and indeed, as we say, regenerative. Well, I dare say this debate will continue. I'd like to thank my guests, Clare Hill and Karl Williams. That's all for now. We're back soon.